If I play you a sentence in Swedish and you speak Danish, you'll understand most of it. If I play you a sentence in Norwegian and you speak Swedish, same thing. The three Scandinavian languages are the mutually intelligible in a way that almost no other set of distinct national languages is. But the grammar, the vocabulary, the structure, close enough that a speaker of one navigates the other two with effort rather than impossibility. This has a very practical consequence for language learners that almost nobody talks about. Learn one Scandinavian language, and you haven't learned one language. You've learned the key to three. Welcome to the Airlearn Language Show. Today, we're going inside the Scandinavian language cluster, how it formed, how mutual intelligibility actually works in practice, why Danish sounds so different from its siblings despite being so close on paper, and what Norway's two written form situation says about the relationship between language and identity. And at the end, the practical question every language learner should know the answer to. Which one do you start with? If any of these is on your list, Airlearn teaches Swedish. Links in the description. Now, how three countries ended up speaking the same language without agreeing on it. Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian all descend from Old Norse, the language spoken across Scandinavia and Iceland from roughly the 8th to the 14th centuries. Old Norse didn't split immediately into three neat languages. It split gradually, regionally, over centuries as political borders hardened, as contact between regions decreased, and as each area's speech evolved under slightly different influences. What shapes the modern languages most dramatically was politics, not linguistics. Denmark was the dominant Scandinavian power for most of the medieval and early modern period. From 1536 to 1814, nearly 280 years, Norway was under Danish rule, and Danish was the language of Norwegian administration, law, the church, and educated writing. Norwegian as the formal written language effectively ceased to exist during this period. Educated Norwegians wrote in Danish. The spoken language continued evolving in Norwegian mouths, but the written standard was Danish. Sweden, meanwhile, was establishing its own political independence and its own literary tradition. The Swedish Bible translation of 1541, Gustav Vasa's Bible, did for Swedish what Luther's Bible did for German. It standardized a written form and spread it through every church in the country. Swedish diverged from Danish, not because the spoken languages drifted dramatically apart, but because two separate written standards were being codified and promoted simultaneously. By the 19th century, three national identities were crystallizing around three languages, even though those languages were still close enough to share a conversation. Mutual intelligibility between Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian is real, but it's not equal, and it's not automatic. The specifics are worth understanding because they're more interesting than the simple claim that Scandinavians understand each other. Norwegian sits in the middle. A Norwegian speaker typically has the easiest time understanding both Swedish and Danish, and Swedish and Danish speakers typically find Norwegian the easiest of the three to understand. This is partially because Norwegian, in its spoken form, preserved more features of the common Old Norse base that Swedish and Danish each moved away from in different directions. Swedish and Danish speakers understanding each other directly is harder. The grammar and vocabulary are still largely shared, but the phonology has diverged enough that comprehension requires more effort and more exposure. Research on Scandinavian mutual intelligibility consistently finds that Danish is the outlier. Danes understand Swedish and Norwegian better than Swedes and Norwegians understand Danish. Not because Danish grammar or vocabulary is more different, it isn't, but because Danish pronunciation has undergone changes that make it significantly harder to parse orally, even for speakers of the closely related languages. There's also an asymmetry built by geography and media exposure. Swedes consume a lot of Swedish dubbed or Swedish subtitled content, which limits their exposure to Danish and Norwegian. Norwegians and Danes, living in smaller countries with less dominant media industries, have historically consumed more Swedish content, which means they've had more passive exposure to Swedish and understand it more easily. Mutual intelligibility in the Scandinavian context is as much about exposure as about structural closeness. In practice, what this means is Put a Swede, a Dane, and a Norwegian in a room, and they can have a conversation. It will go more smoothly if the Dane speaks clearly, and the Swede has spent time in Norway. It will require occasional repetition and some tolerance for partial comprehension. The potato joke is Scandinavian. Swedes and Norwegians say Danes speak as if they have a potato in their mouth. It's affectionate. It's also linguistically accurate in pointing at something real. Danish has undergone a set of sound changes over the past few centuries that its sibling languages did not follow. And those changes have moved Danish pronunciation significantly away from what the shared vocabulary and grammar would suggest. The most significant is the phenomenon called the stud, a kind of creaky, constricted voice quality that Danish applies to certain syllables. It's a distinctive prosodic feature that has no equivalent in Swedish or Norwegian, and it gives Danish speech a characteristic texture that sounds, to unaccustomed ears, like the speaker is swallowing parts of words. Danish also softened its consonants more aggressively than Swedish or Norwegian. Consonants that are clearly pronounced in Swedish and Norwegian have weakened or disappeared entirely in Danish speech. Here are 3 ways to say bread: in Danish, in Norwegian, and in Swedish. But in the spoken Danish, the D at the end is not pronounced the way a Swedish or Norwegian speaker would expect. It softens into something closer to a TH sound, or disappears almost entirely depending on the dialect and the speed of speech. This is why research consistently shows that Danish schoolchildren score lower on tests of ability to understand their Scandinavian neighbors than Norwegian and Swedish children do. Of the 3 countries, Norway has the most complicated internal language situation, and it comes directly from the political history that shaped all 3 languages. When Norway gained independence from Denmark in 1814, it faced a specific problem. Its educated writing language was Danish. The spoken language had continued evolving in Norwegian mouths for 400 years, but there was no standardized written Norwegian. The country needed one. 2 solutions emerged, promoted by 2 different movements with 2 different versions of what Norwegian identity should be. The first solution was riksmål, later standardized as bokmål, meaning book language. This approach accepted the Danish-influenced written tradition and reformed it gradually towards Norwegian pronunciation and usage. Today, bokmål is used by roughly 85 to 90% of Norwegians as the written standard. The second solution was championed by a linguist named Ivar Aasen, who in the 1840s and 1850s traveled through rural Norway documenting the dialects that had evolved independently of the Danish written tradition. From those dialects, which had preserved more features of the Old Norse spoken language, Aasen constructed a new written standard that he argued was more authentically Norwegian. This became landsmål, later standardized as nynorsk, meaning New Norwegian. It's used by roughly 10 to 15% of Norwegians today, primarily in the western fjord regions, where the rural dialects Aasen documented were the strongest. Both forms are official. Norwegian schoolchildren learn to read both. Government documents are published in both. Norwegian broadcasters are required to use both. A civil servant writing in nynorsk to a bokmål-speaking colleague is writing in an official language of the same country. The debate between the 2 forms has never been purely linguistic. It has always been about identity, about what Norwegianness means, about whether the country's cultural foundation is urban and connected to the European written tradition, or rural and rooted in the Old Norse spoken one. The language debate in Norway is a proxy for a deeper argument about which Norway counts as the real Norway. Here's the practical question for the mutual intelligibility situation raises for a language learner. If Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian are this close, what does learning one actually give you access to? The answer is more nuanced than learn one, get 3 free, but it's also more generous than most people expect. If you learn Swedish to a solid intermediate level, you will be able to read Norwegian and Danish with meaningful comprehension relatively quickly. The grammar is the same in its essential logic. The core vocabulary is largely shared. The differences are in spelling conventions, some vocabulary divergence, and the phonological shifts we discussed. Spoken comprehension is a different story. Understanding spoken Norwegian from a solid Swedish base is achievable with exposure. Most Swedes who spend time in Norway report comprehension developing noticeably within weeks. Understanding spoken Danish from a Swedish base takes longer because the phonological gap is wider. But it's not starting from zero. It's starting from a position where the vocabulary is already largely known and the grammar is already internalized. The work is purely phonological, which is a much smaller task than learning a new language. What this means in practicality. The Scandinavian cluster is the most efficient language family in the world for learners who want coverage across multiple languages. The marginal cost of adding a second or third Scandinavian language, once you have one, is lower than almost any comparable investment in language learning. The question of which to start with has a defensible answer. Norwegian, specifically Norwegian bokmål. It sits geographically and phonologically between Swedish and Danish, which means a Norwegian base gives you the most balanced starting point for comprehension in both directions. Norwegian is also phonetically closer to its spelling than Danish. What you see on the page is closer to what you hear, which makes it more learnable in the early stages. Swedish is the second most practical starting point, the largest native speaker population of the three, the most internationally prominent Scandinavian language in terms of media and cultural output, and well supported for learners. Danish is the hardest starting point purely because the phonological gap between spelling and speech is the steepest, but it's not a bad choice if Denmark specifically is the goal. Any of the three work. The point is that whichever one you choose, you're not just learning one language, you're buying into a cluster. Linguists have a saying, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian each have armies. So they're languages. The distinctions are real. Danish pronunciation went somewhere, and Swedish and Norwegian didn't follow. Norway built two written standards out of a political argument about national identity that no one has fully won. Swedish standardized early and stayed relatively stable. 3 different histories, 3 different phonological trajectories, 3 different relationships to the shared inheritance. And yet, a Swede, a Dane, and a Norwegian walk into a bar, and they mostly understand each other. The political separations didn't erase the linguistic closeness. They organized it differently into 3 systems that kept enough of the same logic that the conversation is still possible, 1,000 years after Old Norse split into its descendants. For a language learner, that's not just interesting. It's an opportunity that almost no other corner of language learning world offers. One investment, 3 returns. A cluster so close that the marginal cost of the second and the third is a fraction of the first. The bar is open. Pick a language. The other 2 are waiting. If Swedish is where you want to start, Airlearn teaches it. Contextual, practical, built to stick. Link in the description. See you in the next one.